may be seated. Shabbat Shalom. You know, I'm a member of an organization called Truah, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, and it is a trans or multi or non-denominational organization of rabbis and cantors who support human rights, which is a good thing. You know, works on human rights issues in Israel and the territories here in the United States, other countries as well. And I have two T-shirts with the same slogan. One is black and one is gray. And they say, resisting tyrants since Pharaoh. And tell you, whenever I wear that shirt, I always get a lot of comments about it. Because it resonates not only with Jewish people, right? But, I mean, African Americans in particular, right? The African American story going back, I mean, you know, a lot of Jews sing Go Down Moses at their Seder, right? Which is a black song that was written while blacks were still held as slaves in this country. And if you listen to the speeches of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the allusions are really to the Exodus. They're not, you know, even though he was a Christian minister, almost everything that he said really was from the Hebrew scriptures and not so much from the New Testament, right? So it is a story that really is universal in a way, right? And a story can be both particular and universal at the same time, right? And so there's a book by Michael Walzer called Exodus and Revolution, okay? Michael Walzer is one of the most important philosophers of our era. And I say philosophers and not Jewish philosophers because he is a Jew and he works in the area of Jewish thought, but not only of Jewish thought. And he's a professor emeritus at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, and one of his books called Just and Unjust Wars, which is like the sort of classic place that you look for what's known as just war theory, right? Just war theory, which goes back really to St. Augustine, right? And you know, within just war theory, and it's not sort of a tangent, but right, there's jus ad bellum and jus in bellum, right? That is to say, is it lawful, is it just for me to launch this war? And having launched it, am I fighting it in a just manner, right? And you can be morally correct in having launched a war, and yet the way that war is being fought is not just, right? And we could all probably think of examples, right? But another book that Walzer wrote, very important book called Exodus and Revolution. It's a short book, but he looks at the story of the Exodus and how it has been used throughout history to justify revolution, okay? And he said it first dawned on him, actually, and Michael Walzer is still with us, but he's an elderly man now, and he said it first occurred to him to write this book when he was participating in the civil rights movement in the South in 1961. Okay, when he went to a black church and he heard a whole series of sermons about the Exodus, right? And so Rabbi Adam Greenwald from Los Angeles writes about Walzer's book. Good stories begin with the words, once upon a time. They take place in a single point in history, a moment that is remembered and retold. Great stories happen in an eternal present, a drama that we enact with our lives. The Exodus is one of the latter. As the Haggadah tells us, in each and every generation, a person is obligated to see themselves as a personal participant, right? We read that in the Haggadah, right? B'chol dor v'dor, right? That the Haggadah, the Exodus, the Seder, is not merely about what happened to our ancestors 3,500 years ago, right? It is about that, but it's not only about that. It's also about our story right now. Right? Our story right now. And so Walzer says that there are three core principles to the Exodus story. Okay? And I have to say that you know, it's interesting. I did not go to my college graduation, okay? And the reason that I did not go to my college graduation is because I found the speaker that they had chosen for that graduation to be morally repugnant, and I didn't want to be there, okay? So, and my classmates, others handled it in different ways. Some stood up and turned their backs toward the speaker. Some got up and walked out, and I'm just not going to be there, right? But 5 years later, my brother graduated from the same institution, and I went to his graduation, and the graduation speaker, this was 1986, was a cardinal who was the head of the Catholic Church in the Philippines, and he helped to lead the overthrow of the Marcos regime in the Philippines. And actually, I have to say, he had one of the great names in the history of the church, right? Michael knows, right? His name was Cardinal Sin, right? Cardinal Jaime Sin, that was his name, because he was actually of Chinese ancestors. The last name was Sin. So listen to Cardinal Sin, and asked me, well, and I said, I felt almost as if I was listening to Moses describe how he led the Exodus out of Egypt, right? It was that moving, right? So it's a universal story, but it's also a particular story, okay? And so Walzer says there are three core principles of the Exodus story, okay? And here's the first principle. Wherever you are, it is probably Egypt, right? Wherever you are, it is probably Egypt, right? Because in every society, there are elements which are oppressive, tyrannical. They're often well hidden behind a facade of normality, right? But they are Egypt, right? And one of the things that's worth pointing out is what does the word, the Hebrew term for Egypt, Mitzrayim, right? Mitzrayim, and it means the narrow strait, the narrow place, right? And that's what oppression really means, right? We think of it as, but it's literal. It presses in on you. It presses in on you. So wherever you are, it's probably Egypt, right? But then comes the second principle. There is a world more attractive, a better place, a promised land, right? In other words, right now you are in Egypt, but the promised land is not fiction. The promised land really does exist, right? And why is it important for us to understand that the promised land exists, right? Because if it doesn't, there's no hope. Exactly, right? If there is no promised land, then there's no hope. We are in Egypt, we are stuck there, and there is nothing that we can do about it, right? It's kind of like learned helplessness, right? Learned helplessness, and there is not, I find there are very few things that I find more frustrating than when people have that attitude, right? There's the dry bones, right? Avdat tikvatenu, right? Our hope is lost. No! Oh, lo avdat tikvatenu, right? Our hope is not yet lost, right? But if you have no hope, then you are stuck, you wallow in your own misery, but you are paralyzed from taking any steps to make your situation better, because it can't get better, right? There is no promised land, right? So we have to believe that there's a promised land, or else there's no hope, right? And once we give up hope, that's the end of what? Give up life. Right, you give up life, and that's the end of the story, right? So wherever you are is probably Egypt, but the promised land is real, right? Did you have something to say?
Yeah, you can't say this. I will say this, and I apologize to anybody that I might offend for continuing your metaphor, analogy. If we are in Egypt, is Trump Pharaoh? Go you respond.
Right, I mean, all right, but here, here is the unacknowledged undercurrent of the whole Torah, except in the book of Genesis, right? Is that we're constantly yearning to go back to Egypt, right? We're constantly yearning to go back to Egypt, right? So many times the people rebelled against Moses, right? Why did you bring us out of Egypt? Everything in Egypt was so wonderful, right? Let's go back, right? And, why is he president? Right? Because we chose him the second time, right? We did, and that's, whatever look, whatever you think about him and his policies, right? He's legitimately the president. He won that election fair and square, right? So sometimes we're in Egypt because Egypt is very comfortable, right? Or we think it is because we're not up to the challenge of freedom. Why? And that brings me to Walzer's third point, right? The only way to the promised land is through the wilderness. There is no way to get there but by joining together and marching, right? There are no shortcuts, right? And that's the other sort of unspoken and unacknowledged part of the Exodus story, right? Is that 40 years it took us to get there, right? And we had to do it together. And we had to go through the wilderness, and there aren't any shortcuts, right? And that third principle, I think, for us as Americans, is the most challenging, right? Because, look, and I mean, for me, right, as somebody who's not only American, but grew up in New York, right, I have no patience. I have none. I have no patience. I don't, okay? And there are constantly, I mean, most of you have never been in a car with me as the driver, okay? But if you have, you would say, I thought he was a rabbi, apparently that he was a sailor, because I have no patience, right? But right, we don't want to believe that it takes a long time, and that we have to go through the desert, and that we have to suffer, and we have to pay a price, and there aren't any shortcuts, right? And, I mean, I think the American Jewish community is particularly susceptible to that, right? It's like, we're constantly looking for the magic bullet, right? And as soon as we find the magic bullet, all of our problems will be solved, right? And no, I mean, we can get to the promised land, but in order to get to the promised land, we got to go through the desert. And it's going to take a long time, right? And so I think that those three kind of universal rules of the Exodus, right, to me, I mean, they apply societally, right, but they also apply individually, right? Each one of us has our own Egypt, right? Each one of us has our own Egypt, and what is your Egypt that you have become accustomed to, right? What is your Egypt that you become accustomed to? And what is your promised land, right? And what is the desert that you have to go through to get there, right? And it's a very individual thing, but I think, if you look at the strength of that story and you understand, the three rules, right? Wherever you are, it is probably Egypt. The promised land is real. The only way to the promised land is through the desert together. No shortcuts. Yeah, Linda.
It seems like humanity has to change. I mean, back to the Messiah thing or whatever, the perfect world, but each person, yes, they have to stop hate. They have to stop. If everyone in the world would do that, then there wouldn't be war. It's like the ideal is for each of us to be loved and godly, and right. But what's so hard is watching so many people with hate speech or whatever. Because if they weren't, and the next one wasn't, and the next one wasn't, we'd all be peaceful. So it does start with us, but it's hard societally with the way humanity seems to have ego all the things that are making themselves first.
Right. I mean, there is it's human nature. It's not just sort of externally imposed systems, right? And that's what I think is so dangerous, right, about the moment that we in the United States find ourselves is this polarization, right? Because I have no hesitation saying that the people who disagree with me, with the larger issues of society are wrong, okay? But there's a difference between saying they are wrong and saying they are evil, right? Because there's no compromise with evil, right? And if you listen to the kind of rhetoric, right? And even like in politics, right? I mean, will we ever have an agreement with Iran, right? And if they're evil, right? There's no compromise with evil. Evil has to be eradicated. Evil cannot be accommodated, right? And so the minute that we see our opponents not merely as wrong, but as evil, right, we're in a very, very dangerous situation where no sort of accommodation becomes possible, right? So to some extent, and and here, like, I mean, I quote Rabbi Jonathan Sacks a lot, right? But Sacks says something similar, right? Is that pretty much every religion says, my religion believes in peace, right? My religion teaches about peace. My religion, my texts hold up peace as the highest value. Therefore, if everybody had my religion, we would be at peace, right? May be true, may not be true, but that's not, right? That's not what Sacks is advocating, right? He's saying, no, right? Peace does not come from everybody being your religion. Peace comes from learning to live with people of other religions who have different texts, right? And that's, and so, that idea of pluralism, right? And so you're right, and it's very, very difficult. It's really very difficult. And again, I mean, I have to check myself all the time, right? What am I saying about people with whom I don't agree, right? Are they just wrong and misguided, or are they stupid and evil, right? And that comes down. And it's not just politics, right? I mean, like, think 15 years ago, right, the debates over the future of Kehilat Shalom, right? No, but it did, because why? Because people weren't able to say simply, I disagree with you, you're wrong, you're misguided, right? You're evil, or you're dumb. Right? And that's and we have to check ourselves when we are, when that's the way we're talking, when we're in conflict, right? So that's part of the human nature too, right? And you can, have all the good ideals in the world, right? But if you fight for the right thing in the wrong way, right? Justice in war, not just is the war just, but are we fighting a just war by just means, right? And very often, in terms of our political and civil life, we find ourselves fighting just wars by unjust means, right? And that's where we have to really be careful. Anyway, Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach. Yeah.
To extend your citing of the three aspects